بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على نبينا Muhammad وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. We reached the Umayyid Caliphate. Last time we left off with the death, the assassination of Ali radiallahu ta'ala an by a Khariji, and the agreement between Al-Hasan, the son of Ali radiallahu ta'ala an, and Muawiyah. Al-Hasan agreed with Muawiyah that he will give up the Khilafah for Muawiyah under certain conditions, that the bloodshed stops, the attacking of between Muslims comes to an end, and Muawiyah radiallahu an agreed upon that. So now we start with Muawiyah and the Umayyid Caliphate. And it's also important to understand the reality, the context. So now you have, really the Muslim Ummah is divided into three. You have the pro-Muawiyah group in Syria and the western part of the Muslim world. You have the pro-Ali group who are in the eastern part, Iraq, and east of that. And you have other kind of isolated groups like the Khawarij, who are kind of out there and who will pop their head out as soon as disagreement occurs between the Muslims. And that's the reality. SubhanAllah, until this day, they're exactly like that. When things are stable, you don't hear from them. As soon as things get a little bit shaky, mashallah, their head pops up and they try and take advantage of that. So the Umayyad Caliphate starts with the moving of the Muslim capital from Medina to Damascus. Now remember, Muawiyah radiallahu an, during the time of Abu Bakr, or during the time of Umar radiallahu an, and Uthman, and even Ali, he was the governor of Damascus, Syria. This entire region here, Jordan, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, right, parts of Iraq, because that was considered to be the Levant, he was the governor there. And his brother was the governor prior to him. So the Umayyads have had 30 years experience in Damascus. And they had the relationship, they had a system there, and they were learning. And the people liked them there. So even non-Muslims living in this area, they were okay with the Umayyads governing them. So Muawiyah moved the capital to Damascus. This is where it is now. So when Muawiyah came to power, there were several challenges that he was facing. I stated a few. There was still disunity amongst the Muslims. They were disunited. Right? Also, you had the religious fanatics like the Khawarij. You have a lot of resentment in this area, in this time. People are really resenting what happened, and they're shocked. Uthman was assassinated. Umar radiallahu an was assassinated before that. Right? And Uthman was assassinated, and Ali radiallahu an was assassinated. Three of the most righteous believers, the Khulafa al-Rashidin, were assassinated. They were killed. Right? And that's just shocking to the Muslims. And, they did not know, or they're still trying to learn how to deal with this. How do we recover from this? How do we do this? So really the odds were against Muawiyah. So he had to try and create a project that will reunite the Muslims. And on top of that, the Muslims looked to Muawiyah as being lesser than his predecessors. That's the reality. His credentials were less. He was not as knowledgeable, nor was he as pious. Not to say that he didn't have an amount of knowledge, nor are we saying that he wasn't pious, but in comparison to his predecessors, it just was not the case. Muawiyah radiallahu anh accepted Islam later on. Some narrations say during the time of Sulh Hudaybiyah, so around 6 or 7 of Hijrah. Some say it was after the conquest of Mecca, around 8. Right? And remember, he is the son of who? Abu Sufyan. So Muawiyah was among the princes of the enemies of Islam for a long period of time until he accepted. Right? So this was how people viewed him. The odds were against him. So it seems like when you look at Muawiyah's political strategies, it seems like his project was to centralize the Muslim government. Right? Why? Because by making a khilafah, a caliphate that was central to the Muslim ummah, essentially you are creating a concept that people are loyal to instead of necessarily a person. Right? Because Muawiyah radiallahu anh may not have felt that people are going to really accept him, but perhaps they will accept a centralized khilafah that is meant to cater to all of the ummah. Right? And on top of that, among the challenges that he was facing were Arab tribalism. Arab tribalism is really the strength of the Umayyads, and it's also the downfall of the Umayyads, as we will get to. So he's dealing with that too, and perhaps he saw that this is actually a problem, which it would become a problem, will become a problem shortly, inshallah. So he was trying to make a centralized government, and his politics, his administration really focused on building that. So when you look at him politically, he was political, practical rather than idealistic. Okay, so when you look at the Muslims, like Ali radiallahu an, he was an egalitarian. He was someone who it is about bringing about the ideals of Islam, the best practices of Islam. It's about being the most virtuous person. Uthman, Abu Bakr, and Umar radiallahu an were like that. It's about the ideals, right? But Ali radiallahu an, as we mentioned last time, he's dealing with a generation of Muslims who weren't raised on the hands of the Prophet ﷺ. That's just not going to work with them, right? So Ali radiallahu an, although his strategy, his politics were more in line with Quran and Sunnah, or at least more trying to adhere to the idealism or the ultimate virtues of the Quran and Sunnah, Muawiyah radiallahu anh, on the other hand, was like, you know what, we need to be practical. The reality is, people are divided. The reality is, not all of these Muslims care so much about piety like we did on the hands of the Prophet ﷺ. Some of these Arabs care about being Arabic, right? More so than being a Muslim. Also, you had the Khawarij, who were wreaking havoc and whatnot, continued conquest. So among the projects that he used to really keep Arabs not bickering between each other is having them being on the front lines. So he would take these Arab tribes who were very much accustomed to a rough and harsh lifestyle, and he was putting them on the front lines, right, and making the enemy where? Outside of Islam, and not in Islam itself, right? Because subhanAllah, when you look at human beings, it seems like, you know, when we don't have an enemy, we become enemies of one another. And the Quran, and this is a human reality, subhanAllah, right? And the Quran seems to kind of, you know, deal with that reality, and that is Allah makes an enemy for us. Not makes it, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us of an enemy. But who is that? The shaitan, right? The shaitan is your enemy. He is your common enemy. Unite against him, because if we're not united against him, we become enemies of one another. That's just a personal theory. Now, Muawiyah radiallahu anhu was quite a political genius. And also, he was very well respected and well-treating of the people. He did establish peace for the next 20 years. People were content with his government, with him as a person. He was generous, known for his generosity. He would give a lot of money. And that's how he won the loyalty of a lot of Arab tribes. He was very patient, very forbearing. Right? He was forgiving. People would ridicule him. He would get a lot of attacks and criticism. Oh, you were the enemy of the Prophet ﷺ for a long time. He would get that a lot, but he would kind of just let it go and deal with his situation. When it comes to his administration, so I kind of started talking about this. He took steps towards transforming a coalition of tribes into a centralized government. We need to make the Muslims united, and we do that by uniting them under a common government, something that is relevant and inclusive rather than exclusive. Some of the ways he did that was began to transform a confederation of Arab clans into a centralized government, build up public treasury by using reserved lands and investing in cultivation and irrigation, in making jobs, making sure people are busy with their worldly affairs. And for a pious community like the companions, this was problematic. This was concerning. What are you doing? We are a people meant to call to Allah and work towards the next life. And here you are building the economy, building our worldly affairs, and they saw that as being, a move from a ummah of piety that is working towards the next life to a government that is focusing on this life. Right? He made cases for new religious and ideological grounds for loyalty to the caliphate as an office, rather than the virtue of a leader that the Arab tribes were used to. So when you look at, for example, Western critiques of the four Khulafa, the Rashidin, it is quite disastrous from this perspective. How can 3 of your leaders be assassinated? 3 in a row. That is a disaster. Imagine 3 presidents in a row being assassinated. The Kennedy situation was I mean, how can you think of that? How can the president of the superpower of the world be assassinated so easily, right? And even then, when you look at the situation, the conspiracy theories and things point to it was an inside job and whatnot, but that's not the talk here. So Muawiyah radiallahu anh, perhaps he noticed this. We can't let these people be attached to the khulafat to where when one dies, it becomes absolute chaos. Rather, the loyalty needs to be to the ummah rather than to a particular individual. Contrary to the common stereotypes, meaning Muawiyah, was not a nepotistic ruler. Nepotism means you choose your family members to kind of rule. Rather, unlike Uthman, he did not use much of his family. Uthman wasn't building a monarchy, as I'll get to in a moment, as he's highly criticized for, or commonly criticized for. Rather, Umayyids were settled in Medina, away from the center of the power in Syria. In Syria and Egypt, financial administration was left to the hands of local Christian nobles. So when they entered these lands, right, one of the beautiful elements of Islamic expansionism or Muslim expansion was that they did not uproot the previous system and completely transform it. So today in our times, in the nation-state model, we'll talk about the nation-state model towards the later class sessions. When a new government enters, they pretty much dismantle the previous one. That's what happened in colonialism. They completely dismantled the previous system of the khilafah, right? That's the tendency of kings and the tendency that occurs during this nation-state model. Contrary to that, the Muslims, when they would enter a land, they would find the previous, the people who are already skillful, they know the land, and they'd utilize them. They say, okay, here, you were previously the Minister of Finances in Syria for the Roman government, you be our Minister of Finances as well. So even Umar, it said that Umar radiallahu anh used a Christian when he developed what we would call Department of Finances, because the Arabs really didn't know. The Prophet ﷺ says, "Nahnu umma la nahsib." The Arabs are a nation that really don't care much about precision in numbers, right? And we still are like that. That's how we are. We don't 5, 4, whatever. Just put some down. Whereas the Christians and Romans were very much into that. So Umar radiallahu anh, Muawiyah, they chose Christians. And what's interesting is till this day you find this in Arab countries. In Jordan, the Minister of Finance is most likely going to be a Christian, right? People of other religions were utilized in government. They had access to the government. They had positions within the government. At this time, the official language of both academia and government was still Latin Greek. Right? It still hasn't been changed. It will be changed later. Muawiyah radiallahu anh tried changing the currency. He tried minting his own type of currency, but that was rejected by the common opinion. They were accustomed to the gold dinar, which was from the Byzantine Empire, and the silver dirham, which was from the Sasanian Empire, Persian. That's what they were using during the time. The Prophet ﷺ, they continued to use that. Muawiyah tried changing that. It failed, but later it will be changed. Now, you can see how big of a project he has. Once we get to one of Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, you'll see that he accomplishes more, but the implications of what he did are absolutely fantastic. Muawiyah, his vision is very much far into the future. He is trying to bring about a completely revolutionary system for the Muslims. In some ways, he broke from the piety first politics of the Rashidin, right? Meaning, for these other khulafa, these 4 khulafa, it was about taqwa of Allah. It was about applying the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. This is what we're going to do. Abu Bakr would not change anything the Prophet ﷺ did. Umar radiallahu anhu was a little bit more lenient. He said, you know what, things are changing, we need to do, but he was still in line with the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. He just had a different way of applying it. Right? Uthman and Ali radiallahu anhu had the same thing. When Muawiyah took over, he's dealing with a lot more. It's no longer just a group of Arabs who we all know each other, we know how to get along, and if things break out, we'll just reconcile between one another. You have the Persians, you have the Romans, you have the Coptics now who are entering this area. You have a massive amount of land, a lot of civilization, a lot of culture, a lot of religions. It's becoming a pluralistic, diverse society. The ruler cannot just be piety, right? And later on, once we get towards the around the time of Ibn Taymiyyah, actually maybe even earlier than that, you'll see how the Muslims utilize this to be very incorporating to non-Muslims. It's fascinating, and we're building up to this. So this is kind of like a prelude to where we're trying to get to. In other words, he restored unity. In other ways, he restored unity and strength and was the second ablest administrator and state builder of Islam after Umar. So when the Westerners look at Muslim politics, there are three individuals who are considered to be the father of political Islam. Umar radiallahu anh, Muawiyah, and Abdul Malik ibn Marwan. These three people. They built political Islam. Right? Now, at the same time, Muawiyah radiallahu anh is expanding. And one of the, as we will get to towards the end, one of the administrative practices of the Umayyids is expansionism. They are expanding. In fact, it says that, I heard from my teacher, he said that there was a letter written by one of the Umayyad rulers to a non-Muslim neighboring nation. And he wrote the letter as follows. From so-and-so, the Umayyad, to so-and-so leader of this area. We are people of Islam. We believe in nothing, that nothing's worthy of worship except Allah, la ilaha illallah. We call you to this. We don't care about your land. Keep your land, but we want you to be brothers with us. But if you don't, there's going to be a different story, right? This is how they did, and they won the hearts of people, right? But we'll talk more about that, inshallah, in a future session. In this time, he's expanding. Now Khurasan is Afghanistan, parts of Pakistan, parts of Iran. This area right here, now this is entering Islam. And it's becoming one of the military fronts of the Muslim armies. Muawiyah radiallahu anhu, the Umayyads in general, they really used the people of Ta'if, the tribes from Ta'if. They had a very strong ability to administer and to govern. Right? So you see a lot of that. So Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf is actually originally from Ta'if, from the tribe of Al-Thaqif. They were still fighting against the Byzantines. They took parts of their lands under the Caspian Sea. Under it, there are a few areas there that they were able to take. Yazid ibn Muawiyah was also leading raids. At this time, they enter Cyprus and they enter parts of the Constantinople. So the initial efforts to take Constantinople begins actually during the time of Muawiyah radiallahu anh, and Yazid. And there is a hadith which the Prophet ﷺ says the first person to raid or to attack Constantinople is the army is forgiven. And the leader of that is Yazid ibn Muawiyah. Right? I know he's such a controversial individual, right? And we'll talk a little bit about him in a moment, but we need to be fair. But they were never able to take it. Constantinople was not taken until when? The Ottomans. So look at the time frame, subhanAllah. And now in Egypt, Amr ibn al-As was the governor there, and they started expanding westward, entering Libya and Tunis, present-day Tunis, and eventually they reach the Andalusia, but not during the time of Muawiyah, but during the time of the Umayyads. So here you have it here. So the red is, stopped working. Oh, here we go. So this is where the Prophet ﷺ had during his time. The Khulafa al-Rashidun had all this, right? So they started entering Afghanistan and the very tip of present-day Pakistan. This area right here was, I think, under Roman Byzantine rule, but it was taken during the Umayyad time, and the Umayyads took this during their time. So when Muawiyah radiallahu anh dies, Yazid, he's succeeded by Yazid. Now the controversy, probably the thing that Muawiyah is criticized most is he appointed his son as the successor. And no doubt he received a lot of criticism from the companions, and he still receives a lot of criticism. And some people call him the person who introduced monarchy to Islam. And the reality is that's not the case. He did appoint, and he was criticized for that. And someone who thinks that was a wrong mistake, that was a wrong decision, we can discuss that. I personally think it was problematic, because it took away from the concept of shura. However, Ibn Khaldun rahimahullah ta'ala has an explanation. He says that, look, Muawiyah was dealing with Arabism, tribalism. People were united under him. And if you remember last week, we said that the reason why he asked for the caliphate from Hassan, right, wasn't because it was his initial pursuit. Rather, he understood that the people wanted him. They were united under Muawiyah. And if he weren't to take the caliphate, it would have, dismantled the ummah once again, disunited them once again. The same thing with Yazid. People wanted Muawiyah. And therefore, when he chose his son, it wasn't because, right, he felt that, the political leader should be from his descendants. Rather, he felt that people will be united under him. Now, whether he was right or wrong, that's up for debate. And this is not the place to do that. However, he did not start a monarchy. Why? Because this wasn't a practice that continued. The one after Yazid was not his son. And the Umayyads didn't choose their son, or at least their eldest son. So rather, they would choose someone who was most capable of doing that from maybe within the Umayyad tribe. Does that make sense? So it's not like an East or Western monarchy, the European model of government, where it's the eldest son who gets it. It wasn't the case, right? That never really went through, even during the Abbasid time. Right? So you have two opinions here. The main concern with this was, as I mentioned, that it took away from the concept of shura. And if you remember last week, I mentioned that shura was something important. Shura, going against this concept of shura, just to kind of draw the image in our minds, would be like us in America, someone going against the concept of freedom of religion, or that the elections are every 4 years. What do you mean? That's very problematic. This is something fundamental to who we are as a people. So when this occurred, they saw it as taking away from shura, right? With the appointment of Yazid, no doubt, by the way, there were a lot more able-bodied people, more competent people than Yazid. Abdullah ibn Umar was there. Ibn Abbas was there. Ibn Mas'ud, I think, was still alive. Maybe not. There were more able-bodied people from the companions, right? Yazid rules for 4 turbulent years, and during his time, the second civil war breaks out, and that is the rebellion from the Hijaz. So, and that is led by Abdullah ibn az-Zubair, and before that, al-Hussein, radiyallahu ta'ala, the grandson of the Prophet, alayhi salatu wassalam. So, people are upset. Why did Yazid do this? And it starts to divide the Muslims once again. The Iraqis and the pro-Alid group, they see this as unacceptable. How can this happen? We need to do something about this. So they see a leader in Al-Hussein, right? And they sent to Al-Hussein, and remember, the point of this session isn't going to the details, but I'm just trying to put a little context to understand why he did that. So Al-Hussein agrees to meet with them. Things go sour. Other companions advise him against it. So Ibn Abbas, Ibn Umar, Ibn Mas'ud, and Abdullah ibn Zubair advise him against this. Don't do this. Not because they didn't see him as able, but rather they were afraid for him. Look at the situation. How can you trust these people? You don't know that, etc. But Hussein radiallahu ta'ala an takes a different path, and he is killed in Karbala in the Ashura day of Ashura by Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad. Now again, we could start talking about the reality here. Did Yazid command Ubaydullah to kill Hussein? Or was it a plot from Ubaydullah, right, himself to kill Hussein? But again, this is not the place for that. We can talk about that in Q&A if you'd like, or at another time. But the point I want to make is that the killing of the son of the Prophet ﷺ had deep shocks, brought deep amount of concern to the Muslims, and it creates implications, right? This leads to further division. The Hijaz now want to recede from Umayyad control, and Abdullah ibn Zubair is the one who is appointed shortly. Right, so the anti-Umayyad sentiments increase, and a civil war starts to break out again. The Ali Iraqi Shia, by Shia here we mean the supporters of Ali. We don't mean the Shia in terms of a theological doctrine. This has not developed yet. Who had invited him, many joined the governor in killing him. and this is really very sad, right? That those who invited him to be their leader and to rebel against Muawiyah, or against Yazid, were actually involved in conspiring to kill him. Right? It's very unfortunate. And the movement of Al-Hussein radiallahu ta'ala an is at-tawwabun, right? Those who are repenting or the penitent, which promises vengeance or death, right? So this was a very shocking and very sad moment for the believers. And to them, it really brings about a lot of questions. How can the Khalifa do something like this? How can the blood of the grandson of the Prophet ﷺ be spilt? And remember, this is all building upon each other. If we want to understand our history, we need to understand the questions that are being asked and how they were answered, which will show us what led to what. So at this point, the concept of Khilafah and the Khalifa starts to be questioned. Right? Not very little. The doors are now opening. It becomes much more questioned during the beginning of the Abbasid period, which we'll talk about inshallah either next week or the end of next week. So upon Hussein's death, radiallahu ta'ala an, Abdullah ibn Zubair, the son of Az-Zubair ibn Awwam, one of the 10 promised paradise, is appointed as the governor of Medina and as the leader of Medina, as the leader of the rebellion. And now he starts to appoint his people to the areas where they are loyal to him and who want to rebel against the Umayyids. And now the anti-Umayyid group start uniting against the Umayyid, and the call was for shura. Right? We want a government that keeps shura at the front, because shura is not just a political strategy. Rather, there's theological concepts here. Right? There's a theological implication to shura. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَالَّذِينَ اسْتَجَابُوا لِرَبِّهِمْ وَأَقَامُوا الصَّلَاةَ وَأَمْرُهُمْ شُورَى بَيْنَهُمْ وَمِمَّا رَزَقْنَاهُمْ يُنْفِقُونَ. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is praising these group of believers, they are people who, they answer the call of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they establish prayer, and their affairs are done through shura, and they give from what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given them. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions shura between prayer and zakah, which shows that this is very significant. It's as if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is alluding that the amount of shura that we do with one another should be similar to the amount of prayer that we pray. The way we establish prayer and the way we are concerned with giving charity and concerned for the well-being of the poor, we should be concerned with shura. Right? So it is a theological concept where we believe that there's a lot of barakah that comes through shura. Other important companions, Abdullah, son of Abdullah ibn Umar, and Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, refused to be involved again. Right? So to kind of give you some images here of what's going on, if you see on top, this is the key. Abdullah ibn Zubair, his area is blue. So you have this area, right? And you have this area of the Hijaz of Saudi Arabia, present-day Saudi Arabia, and you have this area, Medina and Mecca. And here you have stripes. So Iraq, parts of the Levant are pro Ibn Zubair, and parts are pro Umayyids, or Marwanids as they're called. So the brown area here, the green, which you can't really see, the projector's not really giving a good image. So what you see is there's a lot going on, right? So you have areas where the feelings are mixed. You have areas that are all united under one, and you have other areas are the opponents or the other side. So the Muslims, what we need to understand about Muslims is that they are not quick to attack one another. Before any of this fighting occurs, even during the time of the first civil war between Ali and Muawiyah radiallahu anhuma, right, it wasn't that they met and they went at it, right? As soon as they saw each other, they were ready to kill each other. That wasn't the case. They actually went through rigorous attempts of reconciling that lasted sometimes months, sometimes years, right? So there were 2 years of negotiation with Abdullah ibn Zubair and the Umayyids, right? And these areas, Umayyids fight back. They attack the holy city of Medina and defeat Ibn Zubair's allies in Medina and siege the Harra. So they do attack after the negotiations fail, and the Harra, the massacre here, which is also very problematic. And they want to go to Mecca to finish off Abdullah. In the meanwhile, Yazid is busy fighting the front. He's on the Byzantine frontier, right? Fighting there. He dies. So when he dies, the fighting stops. So Abdullah ibn Zubayr has not been killed yet, but the fighting stops. At that point, remember, the general of the army here, that's in the Hijaz, right, Mecca and Medina, has been negotiating with Abdullah ibn Zubayr and his group for a while. So you can tell they probably built a relationship. So when Yazid dies, the general of that army approaches him, says, Yazid has died, right? Let me go back to the Umayyads and convince them to accept you. He does that, he convinces them and goes back, right? And he says, okay, they're ready, come to Syria, right? Now, look, when there's a lot of benefit, despite our concerns with Western critiques of Islamic history, they sometimes make some good points. All Abdullah ibn Zubayr had to do was go to Syria, and he would have become the accepted Khalifa, right? And this would have ended. He decides that, no, I don't want to go there. That's what I'm saying here. And the general is shocked. Like, you can solve this, just come. No, I don't want to. Medina is my place, right? And things settle down. Abdullah ibn Zubayr becomes a Khalifa for about 10 years. Muslims are still divided. So meanwhile in Syria, Marwan becomes the leader of the Umayyids. After his death, Abdul Malik bin Marwan is appointed, and his general Hajjaj ibn Yusuf sieges Medina and kills Abdullah ibn Zubayr. Right? So this Marwan wasn't as competent as his son, Abdul Malik. But when Abdul Malik comes, remember, we mentioned him as being one of the three, founders or builders of Islamic politics. He was extremely intelligent and extremely smart and clever. And along with Al-Hajjaj, who we know was quite powerful as a governor, they stopped this. They put an end to this, and they clean up the Khawarij, they clean up a lot of things, and then they reunite the Ummah once again. So here are 5 groups during this time. You have the pro-Umayyad Syrian, who are pro-Umayyad Syrians and Yemenis, led by Marwan in Syria. You have the pro-Zubayrid Qaisis, led by Abdullah ibn Zubayr in Hijaz. So when you analyze what's going on here, a lot of the division was between these two groups was actually because of previous tribal rivalry that goes back way back when, right, thousands of years ago, between Adnan and Qahtan, the two father Arab tribes, right? So this rivalry rebuilds during that time, and it becomes almost, this group of Arabs from the tribe of Kalb and these from the Qais, right? They become rivals once again, and they're fighting. Remember, one of the challenges that Muawiyah and the Umayyads were dealing with was Arabism, right? You have the Khawarij guerrilla groups who are in Basra, Yemen, and northern Iran. Remember, anytime there is fitna, these guys come out, which shows you how deviant they are. That the only time they have any voice, any presence, is when things are going bad, right? And then you have the Arab tribes led by Mukhtar al-Ashtar. You have this other group that's going on in Kufa. And then you have the apolitical groups, such as Sa'd ibn Abu Waqqas, Abdullah ibn Umar, and others, right? Okay, so that ends. Abdullah ibn Malik is now the leader, and he becomes, in the year 65, he gains control of everything in 73 after the death of Abdullah ibn Zubayr, and he overcomes the 3 opposing forces, the radical Khawarij, the Kufan Alids, and Ibn Zubayris in Hijaz. Now, Arabization of bureaucracy records translated from Greek and Persian to Arabic. During his time, remember, we said he's one of the fathers of Muslim politics or Islamic politics. He does some phenomenal things, right? Of that, he continues the project of Muawiyah radiallahu anh in trying to centralize the government. But he goes further beyond that by making the Muslim Ummah independent of its predecessing superpowers, of the Byzantines and the Persians. Right? He makes them independent of that, which essentially changes the structure, the hierarchy of power in the world, making the Muslims the superpower. Right? I mean, similar economics today, similar strategies today. When we talk about colonialism, we'll see how the West did the same exact thing or something similar to the Muslims. right? Now, economy, all the economies are connected to what? What currency? The dollar, right? So Ibn Malik, Abdullah ibn Malik, Abdul Malik ibn Marwan does the same thing. He establishes a postal service, right? Post office. He establishes that. Now there's mail being sent, and they had a very interesting system, right? In order to get things going quickly, I mean, you have massive amounts of land here, and you're only using horses. They would have stations, right? And at each station, there is a rider ready with a rested horse. So one horse, one guy would go from point A to point B. At point B, he'd meet someone else, and that person would go to point C, right? So it's not one person making the entire journey, but rather you have stations where at each station they kind of give the person a rest, and they send another person to make it quick. So especially important letters that needed to reach the Khalifa from one land to another land, they had to have a very skilled riders and do that. They also had the bird system where they'd put it on a bird. I don't know if this was developed during his time or later on, but that was another way that the Muslims developed this concept of barid, the postal service. They defeat the Byzantines in a certain battle in North Africa. His 4 sons succeed him one after another. Succession is interrupted by his nephew, Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, we'll get to in a moment. So he rules for 22 years. For the first 8 years of his rule was civil war. Now, Ibn Khaldun, rahimahullah ta'ala, says Abdul Malik ibn Marwan was of the greatest Arab and Muslim caliphates. So, I mean, this is a really important point. We may not agree with all that happened. We may be quite concerned with certain events, right? We cannot let that cause us to be unjust in other areas. He did some phenomenal things that really made Muslims the superpower, right? So he was a great Muslim. He followed in the footsteps of Umar ibn Khattab, the commander of the believers in his religious state. He changes the currency to an Islamic one. He mints this. He was able to succeed. Muawiyah wasn't able to succeed in that regard. Now, Muslims are economically independent, and later they will become the economic superpower. Abdul Malik ibn Marwan builds the Dome of the Rock. Not like this, but he built the Dome of the Rock, on top of the rock that we know, the one that the Prophet ﷺ was on when he ascended to the heavens. He's the one who built that. The Islamic world becomes more independent from other civilizations. The official language of diplomacy and intellectuals shifts to Arabic. There's another important thing. So prior to him, they were using Latin, I believe, or Greek. It was the language of civilization. Now that's changed to Arabic. Right? Just like today, the universal language is English. Back then, it was Arabic. And Abdul Malik is the one who does that. Now we come to Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, someone who's very well known, a very beautiful biography of his. He was extremely pious, and he's considered to be the honorary, Rashidun Khalifa. So many consider him to be the 5th or 6th rightly guided Khalifa. One of his quotes, Muhammad ﷺ, came as a prophet, not as a tax collector. Now, to give you a little context as to why he's saying that, is that the Umayyids, especially the Marwanids, who are part of the Umayyad tribe, they, recognizing the problems and the challenges of Arabism, they actually use that, right, against non-Arabs. So in order to keep the Arabs happy, they give them a special place, and they impose unjust taxes on non-Arabs, Muslim or non-Muslim. It doesn't matter, right? And they also use that for increase the revenue of the nation. Umar ibn Abdul Aziz rahimahullah changes that. He says the Prophet ﷺ did not come as a tax collector. It is not for me to impose taxes on people. He came to open the hearts of people, cause them to enter Islam, right? So it's said, now I don't know how accurate this is, but one of the Western critiques of this Umayyad strategy, they say that the Umayyads didn't want people to enter Islam. Why? Because if they entered Islam, they will stop paying the jizya, and they stop paying these revenues. So in order to keep the revenue of the Khilafah high, they imposed these taxes, right, on both Muslims and those who converted. Why? To kind of say, you're not gaining anything when you convert, right? But Umar radiallahu anh stops that. So that's not the way of the Prophet ﷺ. In fact, it's said that one of the zakat collectors, or the collectors of jizya, which was the tax imposed on non-Muslims, He came to Umar ibn Abdul Aziz and said, people are claiming to be Muslim, or they're accepting Islam so that they don't pay jizya. What should we do? He says, leave them. We are not obligated to test the people's iman or to open their hearts and see if they truly are believers. He was very ascetic. He was someone who wasn't concerned about his worldly benefits and worldly well-being, right? Kind of like exactly like Abu Bakr and Umar radiallahu anhuma addressed non-Arab Muslim grievances. Their conversion was welcome and poll tax waived. Rollback trophy jihad against Byzantine that caused much loss of life. So one of the strategies the Umayyid use, the Marwanids use to keep the Arabs, united and not bickering was that they would send them on battles and missions that really weren't achieving anything. They were just causing loss of life. They weren't gaining grounds, right? So Umar Abdul Aziz stopped that. He reconciled even with radical religious critics like the Khawarij and the certain radical Shiite by opening dialogue and empowering moderates among them. Right? So his strategy was like, no, we're not going to use politics to keep people at bay, but rather we're going to come together and discuss. Okay? You from this group, who's the moderate from amongst you? Come. Why don't you come to the table? From the Khawarij, the same thing. And they start building this kind of culture where, if we have problems, let's discuss it. The West actually uses this. It's called the public sphere. We'll talk about that maybe later on. So other Umayyads resent him and they allegedly poison him. Right? They see him as kind of destabilizing the Umayyad rule. Also during the time of Umar radiallahu an, or rahimahullah ta'ala, it's the beginning of the ulama class. Right? And this is something very important. He initiated the sciences of hadith, encouraged the collection of hadith and seerah, encouraged scholarly circles in Medina and elsewhere to apply Quran and Sunnah to critique government. Up until this point, the caliph was considered both the highest religious and political authority and was responsible for both. Scholars and khulafa were similar intellectually, meaning both were well versed in Islam and other worldly science and engagements. And you start having these reciters of the Quran, hadith collectors, fuqaha. They start developing. Now, what I mean by this is the following. Up until this time, you did not have a class called the ulama, right? A alim, someone like Abdullah ibn Umar, like Ibn Abbas, like the 7 fuqaha of Medina, as we will get to inshallah in our next session, right? These people they didn't have full-time jobs as scholars, right? They weren't imams of masjids who would sit in the masjid and deal with the people's affairs. There was no such thing as that. A alim was also working, doing some sort of other job. Abu Hanifa was what? He was in business. I think he used to sell cloth and clothing, right? That's what his job was. Bukhari also was a businessman. They weren't getting paid for their knowledge. So there was no formal class of ulama. With Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, rahimahullah ta'ala, he starts giving more power and influence to this class of people, right? And until this time, the khulafa were also, we would classify them religiously or in terms of the religious sciences as competent. They knew what they're talking about. So Al-Hajjaj, when he was debating with scholars, he would beat a lot of them in debate. He knew what he was talking about. And sometimes, the scholars would try and make a way out for them through grammar, tricks of grammar, right? And he'd catch it. Right? He'd say, oh, you're saying this and you really mean that. He was a genius. Abdul Malik was a genius. And they were fuqaha too. They understood what they were saying, right? So you didn't have this differentiation. Umar radiallahu an utilizes this group of scholars to be a type of opposition that keeps politics or politicians in check. This is the initiation of that. It becomes much more developed with the 4 imams, which we'll get to inshallah next time. Okay, this is very important. And I want to put a little bit of emphasis on the sciences of hadith because I get this question a lot, right? And there's an increasing tendency to reject hadith in general. How is hadith works? How can we trust something that wasn't written down except 100 years after the Prophet ﷺ said it, right? First and foremost, hadith was memorized during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, was narrated by the companions during his time, right? And also some companions were writing hadith. So Abu Hurairah radiallahu anh says, I am the most knowledgeable of hadith with the exception of Abdullah ibn Amr ibn As. He was more knowledgeable because he would write, I wouldn't. Which tells us what? Some people were writing hadith during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Also, they were narrating the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ during his time. So the sciences of hadith actually started during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Now, during the time of Umar radiallahu an, Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, right, what happens is there's more fabrication going around. Meaning people are saying the Prophet ﷺ said this, right, and he didn't really say that. This is becoming a problem. So Umar ibn Abdul Aziz rahimahullah ta'ala initiates the science of hadith, which was initiated to stop the fabrication of hadith, right? So they develop this science and it starts here. So they start collecting hadith and it reaches really its apex during Bukhari, Muslim, and these scholars, right? And we will talk about that maybe later on. So he's the one who initiates that. And the science of hadith essentially asks the question, how can we conclude that a hadith was said or something was said by the Prophet ﷺ? That is the question of the sciences of hadith. And they developed an epistemology. Okay? So when I say they developed epistemology, an epistemology is a method of reaching a conclusion. Right? So in this time, we still use this. It's called the scientific method. We've all heard of this. Meaning, you have an observation. I made an observation. The sky is blue. Right? That's an observation. Does that make it a fact? No. Actually, our senses perceive that. The sky is blue. I believe that what makes the sky blue is the oceans. The reflection of the water on the sky makes it blue. That's an observation. There's a hypothesis there. Right? Is that enough to say that this is law, a scientific law? No. They need to go through a process. They need to test their hypothesis through various experiments. And it is conditional that these experiments are replicable and the conclusions or the results are consistent. Meaning, in order for this to become a scientific law, any person at any time, anywhere, needs to be able to replicate what was done and come to the same conclusion. This is what makes it a scientific law. The main thing, it's testable. I can test what you do. And the science of hadith does precisely that. You can test the opinions of Bukhari. So today we take it for granted everything in Bukhari is authentic, right? That didn't come out of nowhere. It isn't the scholar said, man, Bukhari was such an amazing guy, right? And you know what, let's just make this slogan where everything in Bukhari is authentic. That's not the way it worked. Scholars challenged the opinions of Bukhari. They challenged every single chain that he brought in Sahih Bukhari. And then they came to the conclusion that, you know what, everything in Bukhari is authentic. Now, some people will differ. Some say, you know, there are some hadith that aren't authentic, etc. But in general, the vast majority of scholars agree that everything in Bukhari is reliable. It is binding upon us to follow in a fiqh manner. Right? So Umar ibn Abdul Aziz is the one who initiates that. Now to kind of give a type of a very quick overview of the lifestyle of Muslims. So I've always had this thirst. Well, how are Muslims living? What were they doing there this time? We're always looking at politics. What was going on? What was the life of an average Muslim in this time in these lands? There were three socio-political visions at the time since the conquest: Islamic, tribal, and imperial. Meaning there were three types of ideologies lifestyles people lived by. You had those who were Islamic. I am living a pious life based on Quran and Sunnah. You have the tribal lifestyle, Arabs, and imperial. Those who had political ambitions. We need to expand. We need to go out. We need to get people to Islam. The succession of Muawiyah against the Adid model, the success of the Muawiyah against the Adid model and the Abdul Malik against the Ibn Zubayr shows the power of secular bonds against the Islamic ideals. What that means, Muawiyah and Abdul Malik were not secular but compromising, pragmatic, and less scrupulous than their counterparts. So tribal and imperial lifestyles really favored this. Remember, you have thousands upon thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people coming under the rule of Islam who weren't Muslim and who weren't raised by the Prophet ﷺ. So for them, their concern was probably primarily worldly, right? And then you have others, their Islam emphasized the worldly dimension of the Prophet's message and had a better sense of the pulse of the secular tribal world, willing to compromise when they felt necessary. So, in politics, you need to compromise. You can't, in politics, a person has to make decisions that, people of pious mindset will say, you can't do that. That's haram, right? But politicians will say, you know what, we can't do that now, right? You're talking about halal and haram, we're talking about life and death. We're talking about the health of the economy. Right? I'm not saying this is correct or this is accurate, but I'm just trying to portray the mindset. In contrast, society was moving in the opposite direction. So you had this group, but society was moving in the opposite direction. Apart from the political piety of Khawarij, radicalism, and Shi'ism, the piety-minded Arab and non-Arab Muslims began to champion Ali and early Rashidun egalitarian Islamic ideal. The force became the biggest of all. This force became the biggest of all. So once you look at the anti-Umayyad sentiment that eventually causes their downfall, people were getting sick of this. We are raised by the Prophet ﷺ. He came to take us to paradise. It is not our job to cultivate this land or to irrigate it, etc. So the downfall of the Umayyads. Their military expansion slowed down, resulting in increasing division between Arab tribes. If you remember, I mentioned what? That the Umayyads dealt with the problem of Arab tribalism by putting them in the armies on the front lines, keeping them occupied with a common enemy. Once that started slowing down, they started going at one another. So what you see today in the Arab world, right? How they're always bickering against one another, that's just Arabs, I guess, right? I can say that because I'm Arabic. Arabism created Arabism, this use of Arab pride, and to use that against non-Arabs, created anti-Umayyad sentiments in the eastern part of the Muslim world. So the eastern part, mainly non-Arabs. Western part, a little bit more Arabic. Knowledge was spreading in the east, and therefore intellectuals were becoming increasingly critical of the Umayyads. So the centers of knowledge was actually in Iraq, in Persia, this area. Right? Now, intellectuals, they see through these political strategies and political games. Right? We don't buy into this. So they were increasingly more critical of the Umayyads. So now you have the intellectuals are on the pro-Ali side. Okay? And an increase in water resource in Iraq gave the East an economic edge than the West. So the Euphrates, they had a year where they got a lot of rain, and now you have a lot of water, and that irrigates the land. It boosted their economy, making that land more important to the Muslim Ummah than the West. So you know how the rivalry, California and Texas, right? The rivalry between Syria and Iraq. And now I say this, I'm not trying to say, oh, look how similar we are. I'm trying to draw the image in our mind, so that we understand when they feud, sometimes we take it for granted. We say, what's the big deal? Why are they making all this fuss over these things? Isn't it so obvious, right? To us, it's obvious because we're looking in hindsight. But to them, they're dealing with the same problems that today we're dealing with as well, right? And we differ, etc. So from this, we see that there was the downfall of the Umayyads. There were some elements that were economical, outside of their hands. And there were some elements that was political incompetence, and some was straight up racism. So some achievements of the Umayyads, continued expansion. They expanded. Right? And next time we'll talk about how the Umayyads changed that strategy. They turned the Muslim world into the world leader. They became the superpower during the time of the Umayyads. A centralized Muslim government, and they centralized Muslim government and developed departments of government. All of the Islamic world, from Andalusia to Khurasan, was unified under one political leader. This would never happen again. After the Umayyads, the Muslim lands will never, ever again be completely united. So during the Umayyads, from Andalusia all the way to Khurasan was under one Khalifa. As soon as Abbasids take over, this doesn't happen. Because when they take over, Andalusia is actually Umayyad. And it's not under the Abbasid tribe. So from then until now, we have not had a one governor or one Khalifa governing all of the Muslim lands. Their biggest failures, Arabism and pro-Arab politics. They enforced taxes on non-Arabs. whether Muslim or not, Umar II abolished this practice. The end of the Umayyad era, so anti-caliph tensions arise at the intellectual level, which fueled revolts against the Khalifas, and changed scholarly views of the Khilafah. I'll talk about this more later on. So Abu Hanifa and Imam Malik were actually participating in revolts, right? Were encouraging it. Why? Because they were building their fiqh around a concept where the Khalifa is actually a central figure of fiqh. He is the one who's supposed to enforce it. Now later on with Imam Shafi'i, this changes. And I'll get more into detail next week, inshallah. Proto-Sunnism, right? At this time, remember, Sunnism is not an official doctrine. Shi'ism is not an official doctrine. But it starts to develop. You have the proto-phases here. Has emerged, there's no official Sunni, right? The religious consciousness, the piety-minded Muslims fell on a spectrum from pro-Umayyad to pro-Ali. Not all of the Muslims were in favor of Ali. Not all of them were in favor of Muawiyah. There was this balance, right? Not all of them were Republicans, not all of them were Democrats. Again, I'm just trying to draw the image in our mind to kind of understand. Shi'ism at this time referred to pro-Ali sentiments, right? And no official Shia doctrine has been developed. There were Zaydis who go back to Zayd ibn Ali, the son of Al-Hassan, I believe, the son of Ali radiallahu anhu. So this is the great-grandson of Ali, who moved to Yemen, and till this day they're still there. The Houthis, right, which who are kind of trying to gain some ground there, they go back to this guy. The Rafidah, these are a more extreme type of Shia in terms of their doctrine. They who reject the first three Khulafa and say they have usurped the Khilafah from the Ali radiallahu anh, split into two groups, two imamate groups, the 12ers and the 7ers. Other ideological groups, the Murji'a, Qadaris, Jahmis, and the Mu'tazilites are now in the area. And remember this, I showed it to you last week, in terms of the model of authority. Till this point, the Khalifa is both the political and religious authority. And he was accessible. But as time went out, they become less and less accessible. And this creates a lot of anti-Khilafa or Khulafa sentiment. With that, we will conclude this part. There's about 2 minutes until prayer. If anyone has one short question, I can answer that, inshallah.
Whenever I hear about the fight over power and the division, the first thing that comes to mind, I've always wondered about this, is like, if that happened within the companions of the Prophet, among like the best people, like what should we expect from modern day? It's only going to get worse, right?
Not necessarily. I mean, during the 20 years of Muawiyah, it was quite peaceful. The Ottoman Empire was very peaceful internally. It was very united. So I wouldn't consider that to be a rule. Right? They had their certain issues, and they learned how to resolve it, and those issues to break out later on. In general, the society was quite stable. We will see this more and more once we get into the Mongol era, where it's a lot of division, political division, but society in general is still united. Right? A Muslim can travel from Andalusia all the way to the eastern borders of Islam without being questioned. It was still open borders, right? So society was very much stable, but it's the politics that wasn't stable. And when we look at our history, we tend to see the political image and think that that's also the social image. That's not the case. They become so well adapting to this reality that when a leader would come, one group would overpower another group, right? They would come and everything was set. And the new leader would come, he wouldn't change anything. Right? And we'll talk about that inshallah next week. Jazakumullah khair wa sallallahu ala Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.